Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Harley Schlanger. Harley is an historian and national spokesman. He's been covering the financial industry since the 80s for LaRouche PAC. That's LaRouchePAC.com. And I am very happy and honored to have him back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Harley, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Thanks, Dave, and Happy New Year to you and your listeners.
Hey, Happy New Year to you. And let's start off with what's going on with the whole Russian collusion story, where it's starting to break down. We're starting to see cracks, and things aren't going as well as they thought this was going to go when they first started the whole propaganda agenda. What do you see happening here? Why is the whole thing falling apart? And where do you think they're going to go from here?
Well, first of all, I think you have to give a little bit of credit to President Trump because he's refused to knuckle under, at least in terms of the charges against him. He's insisted that there's nothing there. He's continued to fight. And as a result, we're seeing now some of the Republican congressmen show some guts. Nunez, Getz from Florida, Jim Jordan from Ohio, a number of others are beginning to follow the real trail. And what we're finding is that while Mueller can't find any Russian meddling or Trump collusion with Russia, we're certainly finding collusion between Hillary Clinton, the FBI, and British intelligence. And what's become increasingly clear as this Fusion GPS Steele dossier is now under very intense scrutiny is that it's causing a real panic on the part of those who launched Russiagate. Now, the reason for this is you have to start with why they had Russiagate in the first place. The Trump election threatened politics as usual. That is, the politics of geopolitics, regime change, wars, free trade agreements, and so on. Trump said he opposed it, and he took steps in the direction to oppose it, including canceling the Trans-Pacific Partnership, reaching out to Putin in spite of the attacks, and then forming a personal relationship with Xi Jinping of China. All of this went against what was supposed to happen. What was supposed to happen is Hillary is supposed to win, and we were going to get into a near confrontation with Russia. So when Trump got elected and then wouldn't play along with this, they launched Russiagate. Now, when I say they, the evidence shows that this began in the spring of 2015 in London. As we at LaRouche PAC have been pointing out, this is a British operation. It has certainly a lot of supporters in the U.S., the deep state side, the people like Brennan, Comey, Mueller, Clapper. All of them are part of the same intelligence operation as the British GCHQ. But they launched the attack on Trump. The Steele dossier was supposed to be the cherry on the sundae to prove that Trump was corrupt. He was being blackmailed by Putin. The problem is apparently none of it's true. And thanks to a lot of hard work by investigative reporters, by some of these congressmen, and by my association, I mean, we put out a very important report called Robert Mueller is an Immoral Legal Assassin. And he will do his job if you let him. That's available for people on the LaRouche PAC website. We show how Mueller has been a deep state operative for his whole career. Now, as they started digging, they found out first that the Clinton campaign paid for the report by this ex-British intelligence operative. Then what they found is that it was being used by the FBI in the summer of 2016, that is during the campaign, to defeat Trump. So the FBI was operating on behalf of a British intelligence Hillary Clinton plan to smear Trump as a sexually blackmailed pawn of Putin. And we now know this because of the SMS messages recovered from one of the leading investigators from the FBI, this Peter Strzok, his work with Andrew McCabe, who is the deputy director of the FBI with long-term close ties to the Clintons. Strzok sent text messages to his girlfriend saying that they've got to use this material to stop Trump, and if they basically can't elect Hillary, then they're going to have to use it as an insurance policy. Now, this, as you know, is causing such consternation with the supporters of Mueller on the Democratic side and also some of the rotten Republicans that they're now saying to people like Devin Nunes, back off, drop this. The two founders of Fusion GPS had an op-ed in the New York Times 2 days ago saying, all of this is nonsense. We didn't start the story. All we did was try to protect the United States from the nasty Russians. I mean, it's a pretty weak story, and it shows the extent to which the whole fabric of the narrative is collapsing. So we come into 2018 with an opportunity to bury the Mueller investigation, but more importantly, to go after why they did it and to create the room for Trump, if he is so inclined, to proceed with what he said he was going to do during his campaign. So on the whole, we're very optimistic about the potential right now, but it's going to take a lot more work because, as you know, Dave, the people behind Mueller and Mueller himself are not going to stop.
No, they won't. They never stop. They continue on and they push their agenda as far as they can take it. And you mentioned, what Trump said he was going to do from when he during his election campaign, go after Clinton and, find these people and put them into jail and all this stuff. We see the Department of Justice right now. It looks like they're going to start their investigation into the Clinton email server. They're going to be looking at this once again. And we see there's other investigations going on with the Uranium One deal. Do you think right now the deep state is really nervous about the truth getting out there? I mean, do you think any of these people are going to just sit back and relax and say, okay, try to prove it. And if you can't prove it, we'll stand trial. Do you really think they're going to just do nothing from all of this?
Well, no, they never thought that they would be challenged. They figured they had a psychological profile of Trump that he would crack or buckle or walk away. They also underestimated once again the determination of at least a portion of the American population to end this era of the Bush, Obama, Clinton policy control. If you look at it, the deeper underlying issue is that for 16, 17 years, we've been in terrible economic shape. We've lost 6 million industrial jobs. Wages have stagnated at 1989 levels. People lost their savings in 2007, 2008. They've lost jobs. The debt burden on the family is growing. The delinquency rates, the student loans, delinquent car loans. There's been an absolute catastrophe for the American middle class. And at least a portion of that population is saying, we're tired of being told it's our fault. And what Trump tapped into during the campaign was that anger and that war weariness and that distaste for being treated as though they're stupid, the so-called, what do they call them, disreputables or
deplorables.
Deplorables, yeah. So people reacted to that. Now, again, they underestimated it. They didn't think they'd lose Brexit. They didn't think that Trump would win. They thought that Merkel would coast to a fourth term in Germany. They thought that Russia and Putin would capitulate. They thought that the Chinese would collapse in a debt bubble, which I find it ironic that people in Wall Street are attacking a Chinese debt bubble when the biggest debt bubble in the world is on Wall Street. So I think one of the things that Mrs. LaRouche has been emphasizing is that there's an unstoppable momentum around a new economic paradigm. And to some extent, Trump is reaching out to be a part of that. And I think he can see the potential for American firms and American business and the revival of American manufacturing if he can survive this attack against him. Now, what does the other side have? It's life and death for these oligarchs. They are caught. Their hands are in the cookie jar, and the internal video cameras caught the pictures of their hands. And they can say whatever they want. They've been caught. The only question is, are there enough people with the guts in the institutions, whether it's military, some honest people in the intelligence community, and others, who will stand up and say, we're not going to tolerate this. And if that happens, then you can see people going to jail. And you mentioned the Clinton Uranium One, you mentioned the email server. Look, the whole other issue here is the Clinton campaign was a web of corruption. They paid for this Fusion GPS report. They're on the line for it. And, these are serious charges. If the liberals are so upset about meddling in the election, what about this British Clinton FBI operation? So I think, by the way, also, there are a number of people in the Justice Department, like this guy Bruce Orr, who personally met with Steele of the Steele dossier. Orr was a high-ranking Justice Department official. His wife worked for Fusion GPS. It's not as though someone like McCabe was an innocent, honest, upstanding enforcer of the law. He was working with the Clintons. So this corruption, which in the FBI is reminiscent of the old J. Edgar Hoover operations of trying to blackmail presidents and others, they were caught. And I think this is an opportunity to shut down this, what I call the web of corruption.
And I just want to go back to what you said about the debt bubble in China, and no one's looking at the debt bubble here. I mean, here in the United States, we have a huge amount of debt, not just in the United States, but globally, there's just a huge amount of debt. And we're starting to see the same patterns that we saw last year, where there are certain retail stores that are closing now. Actually, retail debt is coming due, and there's a lot of corporate debt out there, and it looks like there's a corporate debt bubble. When you're looking at the economy and you're taking a look around, what are you seeing right now, and how is the economy actually doing?
Well, the corporate debt bubble just passed over $14 trillion. That's the non-financial corporate debt bubble. This is bigger than the mortgage debt bubble of 2007-2008, which was $11 trillion. What's hailed as the great sign of economic strength is the stock market. That's fueled by corporations borrowing money at very low interest rates to buy their own stock or to buy other companies' stock for mergers and acquisitions. So they're building up the debt bubble. At the same time, their actual profits have been stagnant since 2011. So if interest rates creep up, even though they're only 75 basis points up since they started raising interest rates, the International Monetary Fund said if the rates get to 2%, 20% of corporations will collapse in the United States. The Bank for International Settlements said that 10% of the banks and firms in the United States and Europe are zombie firms. In other words, they're only staying alive because of cheap or zero interest. What happens when that changes? So the real estate index is going crazy in the United States. The prices are up 6.2% in the last several months. So today the Dow crossed over 25,000. So this corporate debt bubble is unsustainable. Now you add to that 1.4 trillion in student debt. You add to that the increasingly dangerous situation with auto loans, which I think we're now reaching close to 4.5% delinquency rate. Credit card debt is at record levels in the United States. People are using credit cards to pay for food, rent, and transportation and healthcare. That's unsustainable because credit card debt is high interest. So the debt bubble as a whole is growing. The physical economy is not growing. And the tax reform that was just passed by the Congress has no mechanism to cause the money that the corporations will make in their tax cuts go into something productive. At least when John Kennedy proposed his investment tax credit, the idea was that you get the tax credit if you invest in new plant and equipment, research and development, job training, job hiring, and so on. There's none of that in this so-called tax reform bill. Jamie Dimon said this is QE4. In other words, more money for the banks and their corporate clients to speculate with. Now, the other thing that we're looking at, and this comes from a report in Europe, is that in order to sustain this debt bubble and the profits to cover it, what are they doing? They're going into more risky investments. So unlike China, which is generating credit into production, which means that at some point there'll be a payback, there's no payback from a stock bubble. And every stock bubble eventually pops. So I think that, again, we're looking at a situation where the people who created this have no solution. There are solutions. As you know, Dave, we've been calling for a long time for going back to Glass-Steagall, which would force the speculators to eat their losses. You protect the commercial banks because you want to protect their customers, their depositors, and also create a circumstance where they can loan money for production. But you don't protect the investment bankers and the speculators and the shadow banking community. Secondly, you need new credit generation, the way China's doing it. And for infrastructure, what Trump has proposed, and we'll see what he does in the next couple of weeks. I know he's got people around him from Wall Street who are saying, limit the amount you spend because there's no return. That's stupid. There's never an immediate return for infrastructure dollar for dollar. There's a return over time to the improvement of the whole economy. That's called productive value. And we've lost a sense of real economics in this country. So, what I see when I look at the economy is everything's going in the wrong direction. I think Trump is being advised by Mnuchin and others to get out front and talk about the Trump bull market, which is going to soon become the Trump crash if he's not careful. And he's got to get out in front of that.
Do you think this tax bill that was passed, do you think it's being used to prolong everything, to inflate the bubbles a little bit further?
Sure. I mean, look, these guys don't have long-range plans. These guys are psychotic. The people who run these things actually think that the solution is war and reduction of population. So for them, a long-range plan is, how do we make more money next week to pay off last week's debt? It's a giant Ponzi scheme. And so the real question is, when will we realize that these insane people should be removed from positions of influence? And part of that is we've got to make sure that people understand what is real economics. That's what I do with most of my work. That's what Lyndon LaRouche has done with his last 45 years. Try to educate people on what the real principles of economics are, as opposed to consumerism, speculation, getting rich.
Now, you mentioned war, and we know the deep state, the cabal, they were trying to, and they're still trying to push war to distract from what is going on here. And I noticed that they're using Ukraine, North Korea, Iran. They were using Syria, but that's off. I think that's off their scope right now. And it looks like they're rotating between the two now. Recently, we've seen that Trump approved weapon sales to Ukraine. And we know this was from the Ukrainian Freedom Act, where Congress voted and they said, yes, we can supply them with non-lethal weapons. And the corporate media was out there making a very big deal. When you look at this sale, what was the purpose of this?
Well, I think when you look at the Trump foreign policy, you have to realize that he's surrounded by Bush neocons. And you can't blame anyone for that but him. Although I would say in his defense, perhaps he thought he could buy a little bit of time from the attacks against him by playing nice with these guys. But people like Dina Powell, McMaster, who's a Petraeus protege, they wrote this new strategic doctrine, which essentially tries to characterize Russia and China as adversaries. When Trump actually released it, he said, look, I still want to have a great relationship with Russia and China. And in the document itself, it contains language against regime change. But what's the policy orientation in Ukraine? It's to defend the regime change of the Obama policy. That is to support a gang of neo-Nazi thugs and oligarchs who are destroying the population of Ukraine. And what are we doing? We're now offering them weapons to use against their own population in the eastern part of Ukraine, which is largely Russian ethnic population. That's a disastrous policy. In the Republican platform, there was an attempt to put in a plank calling for lethal weapons to Ukraine. And at the time, Trump and his campaign manager, Manafort, shut it down. And they said, we're not going to do this. At the same time, Manafort was the leading fighter inside the Republican convention for restoring Glass-Steagall. So who is the leading target besides Trump of the Mueller operation? It's Paul Manafort. So you're absolutely right. There is a kind of rotating operation here, but I think we just saw a particularly interesting change occurring in the Koreas. It's partly because the president of South Korea is reviving the Kim Dae-jung policy of the sunshine policy, that is, let's talk, let's not fight. And I think it's also because Kim Jong-un has now decided that he has enough of a deterrent capability, whether his nuclear weapons can hit the United States or not. They can do enough damage that it's unlikely that the sane people in the administration would launch an attack. I mean, Defense Secretary Mattis has said there's no military solution to Korea. So Trump is working with the Russians, with the Chinese, to establish a basis for discussion. And then just a couple of days ago, the North and South Koreans picked up a communication line that had been shut down for a couple of years to talk about cooperating during the Winter Olympics. So what's the reaction from the neocons? Ramp up the Saudi plan for Iran. Use the Ukraine situation. They need war, not just because they need the profits from it. They need the destabilization. They need the distraction. And I think this is something that people have to figure out, because we have no interest in Ukraine. Trump said that during the campaign. We have no fundamental strategic interest in picking a side in Syria or in Iran. So these are attempts to maintain the old geopolitical framework, which is against the actual interests of the United States.
Sometimes I feel when Trump is out there and he's saying, like with Kim Jong-un, our nukes are bigger than yours. And, he's provoking them through language. But to me, it feels like this is a show, that this is all talk to keep the corporate media, the deep state, all off track while he does his other work behind the scenes. It seems like he keeps them busy with all this nonsense because this is what they want to hear.
Look at the whole thing around Tillerson. Remember, the New York Times and others said Tillerson was going to be fired in November, and that there's this huge fight between Trump and Tillerson. Who's the advocate of talking to the North Koreans? It's Tillerson. So while they're hyping the idea that he's about to be thrown out, he's in the middle of these very sensitive negotiations in North Korea, continuing the discussion with Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia. Tillerson and Lavrov, as well as American military and Russian military, successfully defeated the ISIS terrorists that were propped up by Obama and NATO. So there have been successes. Those people who say, it's all negative, it's all bad, are missing the point. Now, whether Trump is clever enough that he's running these deception operations, I'll leave that for historians in the future to look back and figure it out. I don't know whether his seeming lack of discipline is a way to distract the mainstream media and his opponents or not. But it's clear that he has an intention of breaking with these policies, and including, and this is the really important one in the next couple of weeks because of what we were just talking about, the financial crisis, including, will he go back to his campaign pledge against free trade, against the Wall Street policies, against the big banks, and do something to channel credit to the economy? And one signal of that was the other day in one of his tweets. He returned to the theme of acting on behalf of the forgotten men and women. He knows and uses that as a reference point to FDR. He's reaching out to Democrats now. The next couple of days, he's going to talk to them about infrastructure. Here's a golden opportunity to turn the tables against Wall Street by setting up a capital budget, a fairly large budget, to start investing in infrastructure, and then to invite the Chinese to come in, who have already said they're willing to do this, and invest in the U.S. Dave, one thing that I think very few people know about, because it's not covered, is the Chinese are about to invest over $82 billion in the state of West Virginia in coal and chemical projects and other kinds of high-tech areas. $82 billion in the state of West Virginia over 10 years. That's an enormous investment. Why is that not getting reported?
They don't report on anything that doesn't benefit themselves. I mean, because that doesn't go along with their agenda. And I mean, like we said before, where the deep state is rotating between Ukraine, North Korea, and Iran, just recently we've seen, protests that started up in Iran. And it looks like, Saudi Arabia, the U.S., I'm talking about the deep state, most likely is involved in this because the protests actually started out as an economic type of protest against really like austerity. I mean, and it wasn't people throwing things, lighting things on fire. I think agent provocateurs were infiltrated into the protests to build it up bigger than it really was.
Here's what I know on it, that they had a problem with the bird flu that caused them to have to kill a large number of chickens. And the price of eggs went up dramatically. And that was the initial cause of the protests, which then included some reports of some mullahs who were involved in speculation. Apparently some of the mullahs are, I think they're Wall Street titans or something. So you had a lot of poorer people who ordinarily would support the regime come out against it. Now, immediately, the Al Arabiya, the Saudi paper, started hyping this as a revolution against the regime in Iran. And then you had reports that the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, which is an anti-government organization, which in the past was on our list of terrorist organizations. From 2005, I think, to 2012, they were listed as a terrorist group. Hillary Clinton lifted that designation in 2012, and they essentially operate as what you would correctly call agent provocateurs to try and create an Arab Spring type situation in Iran. Now, I don't think it's going to work. I think, in fact, if Trump is foolish enough to put new sanctions on Iran, then what's going to happen is the regime is going to say, look, the reason there's poverty is the U.S., and it's going to backfire. So they seem to have things under control, at least for the moment. You never know in these kinds of situations, but do we really want another Syria or another Iraq in the Middle East?
No, I mean, remember their goal was to go from Syria, then the last country was Iran, and, they wanted to have regime change in all these countries, and I think they lost Syria, and they were trying to skip over and go right to Iran.
Well, also they tried Lebanon. And interestingly, the line on Lebanon is that Iran's terrorist proxy in Lebanon is Hezbollah. But that doesn't work because Hezbollah, which is a Shiite defense organization in southern Lebanon, is in the government working closely with Hariri, who's a Sunni Muslim, and with General Aoun, who's a Lebanese Christian military man. And Lebanon was relatively stable until the Saudis tried to pull the plug on it. So, their whole strategy now is running up against this new reality, which is that the Chinese are coming in with the Russians with offers of economic development. The real test for the Middle East will be, what does Europe do? Because, as you know, Europe was really hit hard by the refugee crisis, people from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, North Africa. If the wars end and we see some of the refugees returning, as they are returning from Lebanon and Jordan to Syria, if you have a viable reconstruction program, the refugee problem goes away in Europe. You'd have to do the same thing in North Africa as well. The other place, by the way, Dave, the other rotating crisis point is Libya, where they're trying to blow that up again. But I think there's a way out of this. But it means we have to go outside of the politicians who operate on the basis of geopolitics. I'm here in Germany. What I see here is complete chaos. The two parties, the leading parties, had their biggest losses ever in the last election. Merkel's Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, who were in a coalition government, they were rejected by well over half the population. What's going to happen now? They're going to form a new coalition. How popular is that going to be, especially if Merkel sticks to her pledge to work with French President Macron to increase the power of the bureaucrats of the European Union in Brussels? So The Europeans have one of two ways of going: either getting rid of the sanctions on Russia and working with Russia and China, and possibly with Trump, or to continue this fake European identity in the EU, which is going to end up leaving them out of this new economic paradigm that's starting to emerge.
Now, can Trump, I know he's putting forth a lot of economic policies. He put forth his tax policy. But as you said before, the economy, the debt level, everything that we're looking at is completely falling apart. What is his economic paradigm shift? Like, what are we moving into right now? What's different from when Obama was president or when, Bush was president? What can Trump do at this time to change anything? Because it feels like everything is too far gone.
You're right in identifying this as a continuation of the policy. I find it somewhat ironic that Trump, who was so effective in attacking Hillary Clinton for claiming there was an economic recovery under Obama, is now using the same fake figures that Obama used to say there's an economic recovery under Trump. The stock market going up and the so-called low levels of unemployment, even though I think the most recent figure is the labor participation rate is even lower today than it was under Obama. It's now down to 62.7%, which means that more than 1/3 of the potential labor force is unemployed. So, why is Trump saying this? I think he's buying time. I don't think the tax reform will do anything to improve the economy. Maybe it'll keep some of the Wall Street guys on his side a little bit longer. But he needs a full break with that. And that break includes what we at LaRouche PAC have been putting forward. Glass-Steagall, stop the speculation. Stop propping up these fake too-big-to-fail banks. Move away from a private central bank Federal Reserve System into a national bank, which is a credit institution. The third of LaRouche's 4 laws is major investment in infrastructure, especially cutting edge. And then the fourth point is you need a science driver. Nuclear fusion is one, space is another. But what's the key? Other countries are already doing this. This is what China is doing. And the Chinese are spending, I think it's close to $100 billion in credit, which is generated from the holdings they have of U.S. treasuries and U.S. dollars, to work with 80 countries in projects now, which are improving the lives of people in those countries. This is the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road. This is the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. The Chinese and the Japanese now just announced 4 joint projects in Africa of major scale. This is occurring around the world. It's creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. It'll create millions of jobs, real wealth production. And Trump is totally intrigued by this. And he continues to have a discussion process with Xi Jinping. He was very much moved by his first meeting with Jack Ma. He's trying to get Jack Ma back to talk to him. So there are a lot of things moving in this direction. I'll point out one other thing. The new U.S. ambassador to Moscow, John Huntsman, is actually working very closely with the Russians to come up with a solution to Ukraine. So while we're seeing in the broad strokes in the media, everything looks the same as under Obama, there are things being done by Trump. The question is, does he trust the American people enough to come out and tell them openly and organize them to support him the way he did in his campaign? And by that, I mean he should have a series of fireside chats where he identifies exactly who it is in the deep state that targeted him. The role of people like Brennan, the pro-terrorist, Clapper, who lied about the NSA spying, Comey, who defended and protected Hillary Clinton. These guys have to be exposed, and he has to explain why they're attacking him and say to the American people, come out and support candidates who will support me on these issues. If he were to do that, I think 2018 would be in the bag for him, and we'd be able to use the new Congress to go with the kinds of measures that he talked about in his 2016 campaign.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. The only problem is you still have the deep state in the wings and they have control of the corporate media where, at every turn, they're going to try to shut them down.
But, Dave, on that point, they have the control of the corporate media, and yet look at all the leaks that are coming out. The fact that the Inspector General of the Justice Department released these hundreds of SMS messages that showed the conspirators inside the FBI operating against Trump. It is getting out there. You're getting it out. I do a number of other radio programs. LaRouche PAC is getting it out. Our dossier on Mueller has gotten into every Senate office, every House office, all the committees. Every one of your listeners should go to LaRouchePAC.com and download this document to see what a complete immoral bastard this guy Mueller is. He was involved in the original targeting of Lyndon LaRouche in the 1980s when LaRouche was working with President Reagan. Mueller is the guy who covered up for the Saudis in their role in 9/11 and in supporting terrorism. He's the one who started prosecuting whistleblowers when he was at the FBI. His buddy Comey is a religious hypocrite. He's a fraud. So these guys, what's coming into the open is something these guys can't suppress. We have to make it a flow of information that overwhelms the ability of the New York Times to contain it.
Harley, since Trump is looking at the Belt and Road, talking to China, where does this actually leave the United States? Because his national security strategy document, in there, he mentions trade, which is very important. And right now, the petrodollar's, under threat, the economy, the debt level. Where does it leave the United States? Where does the United States go from here?
Well, I like the metaphor Mrs. LaRouche uses. The train has left the station. Either we get on this high-speed rail or we're going to be watching the taillights of the caboose as we sink into the status of a fourth world country. The potential, the CEO of Caterpillar, for example, was in China. And he came back and he said, why aren't we building things like this? 2 weeks ago, the Atlanta airport, the biggest hub of air transport in the United States, was shut down for 11 hours because a truck backed up into an antiquated power station. Why can't we rebuild our infrastructure? We could do that. And the Chinese are willing to work with us. The Japanese have offered $10 to $20 billion to help rebuild New York City's infrastructure. So this could all be done. If we go into an adversarial relationship, we're going to end up losing. The Chinese have demonstrated that they will work with countries, whether it's Vietnam, even India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. These are countries that have enormous potential for development. Afghanistan is rich in strategic metals. We're not getting it. All we're getting out of Afghanistan is opium poppies. So we've got to change our policies. And the reason there's a cause for optimism is that we're beginning to turn around this fight against the deep state. As you point out, and I fully agree with you on this, this is not going to be an easy fight, but it's the right fight and the fight that we have to take to restore the principles of the American Revolution. And, I always appreciate talking with you because we get an opportunity to get these ideas out there. If I may, I'll give my email address again because I'm having a very brisk and I think productive dialogue with a lot of your listeners and sending out my articles. I'm just writing one right now, in fact, on the economic crisis. So if people want to contact me, they can send an email to harleysch@gmail.com. That's harleysch@gmail.com. And I'll be happy to send one of my articles and write back to them.
Harley, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, Dave. Good to be with you again.
Yes.